and welcome to What's Brewing in Education, the podcast where we explore timely and important topics affecting schools and communities. I'm your host, Scott Kuykendall, Stanislaus County Superintendent of Schools. In September, a nationwide trend of threatening messages to schools spread through social media platforms occurring in our community. These platforms, originally designed to be a positive, creative outlet, are being used to propagate fear and anxiety. People who shared the threatening message may have done so without fully understanding the impact they have on the community. Joining us in this discussion, Deputy Superintendent of Student Services, Dan Pangrazio with Ceres Unified School District, and Lieutenant Kalani Souza with the Modesto Police Department, an expert in threat assessment and prevention. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. So let's just kind of kick it off with more of a general question as far as tell us what happened and how you responded to the social media threat just a couple of weeks ago in September. So let's start with you, Dan. Let's start with the school district side of the house first.
A couple of weeks ago, we started to get information that there were social media threats that were being spread around the country. And as that information came in, we immediately began investigating, if there was any credibility to those threats or not. Working with law enforcement, we were quickly able to determine that there was no credibility to the general threats. In our district, there was no specific schools named, and so we didn't have to, at that point, determine was there specific threats to specific schools. But that trend of social media threats continued, so for multiple days we had to determine credibility and then just make sure that our schools were safe and we were communicating with our community.
Right. I mean, interestingly enough, it really all ramped up on a Friday the 13th.
It did.
Right. And that was probably by design, obviously. And even as that was going on, I was getting calls from our local superintendents about threats that they were receiving in their districts. And it was all simultaneous and it was all just kind of rolling out. So, Lieutenant Souza, what did you see from your end as far as like a law enforcement perspective?
So for us, it actually started the day before Friday the 13th with an incident at one of our local high schools where school was delayed in the morning because there was a threat received about a explosive device being on the campus. So we had already been heightened at that point. So we had already kind of dove into some of the investigative steps with the social media aspect, and that's where this particular case had come from. And then we roll into Friday the 13th just by happenstance, and we start getting the same notifications as our local school districts of these vague social media threats that were being posted around. A lot of them were just initials, so like MHS, where it could be Modesto High School, or maybe from other cities or counties across the state that had similar names to some of our schools. So parents would see these threats on maybe some of the social media pages they follow or what have you, and then they were reporting them to us is how we started getting notified about them.
Right. Ultimately, do you know where this originated? Because I know that it was more or less online, social media. I mean, kind of diving into it. I mean, was this some type of social media challenge, or what do we know about the actual origin of these threats?
So part of it is still under investigation, but there were some that were originated because of Friday the 13th. We see a lot of times, especially in the public safety realm, of hoaxes on full moons, Friday the 13th, some of these kind of major, I guess, holidays. I would call them, with specific genres. So Friday the 13th is surrounding some of the movies. So we do see a lot of these hoaxes that come out. With this particular one, not sure where it originated exactly, but what we did find out is that some of the threats that were more specific to some of our schools, in particular, one of them, the suspect in the case had actually taken the original post and doctored it to where it came from that particular person's social media and specifically mentioned our local high school.
Let's talk about the credibility of a threat. And how do we assess that? So I know, Dan, that's something that you want to know as soon as possible, right? So you can go ahead and push information out to parents. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, we're working with law enforcement and we kind of need to get the verification from them. Is it credible? Is it not? So what is your approach on the credibility issue?
Yeah, so a good example is in Ceres Unified. We have a very tight relationship with Ceres Police Department. So we have our point people, and I'm the point for safety for Ceres Unified. So once there's a threat that comes to our attention or to the Ceres Police Department, we're immediately communicating and we're finding out what information do we have. Let's go through the specifics as quickly as possible. And then PD at that point is really making the determination of what level of credibility is there? Is it a hoax? Is there no credibility at all? Are there concerns that need to be investigated immediately? And then what actions that we might need to take at that point is determined by that conversation and potentially a threat level analysis as well. So police department might say, we do have some credible information here. What level of a threat do we have? And then what actions might we need to take in terms of communicating to the public, or potentially it could be a lockdown situation at a school if necessary, because you have a threat that really could be credible.
Right.
So it's really that communication. That's the most important thing.
And then from a law enforcement perspective, how do you deem a threat credible or not credible?
So for us, it really comes down to the investigative portion of it. There's some other circumstances that come into play if it's made during school hours, if we're able to identify the suspect and the school officials are able to pull them in, we could start working that angle. If it's, in this particular case, if it's after hours, then we start looking into social media. Can we identify anything from social media? Is there emergency warrants that we could obtain, and really start diving into it that way? And then also just much like from Ceres, we do a lot of communication as well. So in this particular case, a lot of it was the hoax that was going around. So we were able to disprove it rather quickly, with the exception of the one particular case where it's still, even though we treated it as credible, there was no threat to the school, but we were able to deem that it came from that particular student at that particular school.
Yeah.
Okay.
I can follow up on that too briefly.
Yeah, absolutely.
We also had the potential of individuals taking the threats and then forwarding them and adding information, as the lieutenant said. So as we knew there were generalized threats, we were also looking out for the possibility of our students or people in our community taking a general threat and then tagging or labeling on top of that a school name or putting specific information on there, which at any point then puts you into another analysis of that specific threat, because certainly we can never consider all threats to be hoaxes just because they're following up behind something that we believe is a hoax. And so that's the position we were in for multiple days after this started on a Friday 13th.
Right. I mean, that was really unfortunate. I mean, I know of one case where we had 3 different school districts. It was basically the same verbiage, but then the individual would be lifting actual school names from each district and then kind of inserting it on there, right? So then that becomes another piece, a whole separate piece that you have to investigate. What safety protocols, Dan, do you have in place when you're made aware of a social media threat?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, most importantly, right away, it is getting the heads of the PD and the school districts, the safety team together as quickly as possible. It's usually going to be a phone call, or if not, we can do it in person and get to the details of what's going on and what we know. And then at that point, the next step is to make that threat analysis. And so where are we? What's the level of the threat? The level of that threat is going to determine, okay, what are our actions? Is this not credible right from the beginning, and so there's no further action that we need to take? Or is there a concern there that needs to be immediately investigated? That could mean PD taking action in a number of ways to try to investigate where it's coming from, identify the individual. It also could be, in some cases, considering there is a danger potentially posed to a school site at that time. And if that's happening, then our emergency response scenarios that we practice and have in our safety plans and drill all the time, then you start going to that mode where you're saying, look, we may need to do a soft lockdown. We might need to be able to do a hard lockdown to make sure that we have students and staff safe while we determine that there really is no danger to them at that time. So those are the key pieces that you're going through early on when you're identifying.
Okay. And then from a law enforcement perspective, when there's a potential threat social media wise, what are you looking at doing?
The same thing. We're looking at our partnerships with the schools, really what notifications need to be made. Is there a need at this point to release any information. If there is a need, what information are we going to release? Really partnering between the agencies and whatever schools are involved to craft a message on what that looks like. And then from there, just the same steps is really partnering with the school district and having that collaboration. Do we lock down the school? Do we do, a soft lockdown? Do we evacuate a school? What are the next steps? Luckily for us in our county, we have really good partnerships between all the agencies and all the school districts. So we can really determine rather quickly. So our ultimate goal is not to interrupt, the school day. So we don't want to interrupt the education process, but we want to keep our students and all the staff safe. So it's really finding that balance on what do we need to do to make that happen between the two agencies.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about communication, because there's likely going to be quite a few, parents who are watching this. And I know that some of the strategies and the thinking behind kind of when to notify parents has evolved. And I'll just, I'll talk about kind of what is past practice and kind of what, when I was a site administrator, we always wanted to be very careful before we pushed information out, as far as we've contacted law enforcement. We had a very good idea of what was going on, and likely information would be delayed because we wanted to make sure that we had all of our facts straight, all of the details, all of our ducks in a row, because we didn't want to cause concern, have people worry when there really wasn't a need to worry. But at the same time, again, that message was delayed moving out. So Dan, talk a little bit about what, for instance, Ceres is doing now.
Yeah.
I mean, either agreeing or contradicting what I just said.
What's changed really in recent years, I would even say the past 3 years, and it continues to accelerate, is the amount of information that's shared on social media and the speed of communication, which just continues to accelerate faster and faster. We have continued to get input and feedback from our parents that they want as much information shared out as possible, as early as possible. Now, they do understand in the conversations we have that the first priority is to keep students safe. So we have to be spending our time on addressing the emergency situation and preserving their well-being and the well-being of our school staff. And even most likely, the facts that come out an hour or 2 hours later could be different from what we know at 9 a.m. Okay, 11 a.m., maybe new information comes out. Maybe there's press releases that OPD and school district does later, and more information is shared. When we first started doing that, we started getting questions later on from parents saying, hey, why didn't you share all that information that at 9 a.m. that now we're seeing at 3? But once we explain that we're sharing what we can at that point in the investigation and sharing the maximum amount of information we can, and then we're going to come back and we're going to communicate with you again with more information. And a lot of that becomes conversation with PD and our communications leads and officers to put out communication that is the same information going out to our parents and community. So that's the dynamic that we've been working through, and just I think listening to parents and what their wants and needs are is critical. That's how we went through that learning process. It's their precious children that are there under our care, and number one priority is safety, and people want to know what's happening as quickly as possible.
So from a law enforcement perspective, what is being done to monitor online threats? And part of my question too is I'm wanting to know, are you also working with other agencies, either local or federal agencies, as you're kind of working through this process?
Yeah, so we do have several safeguards in place, the school district being the biggest partner. A lot of times there will be Google searches, on whatever the threat might be, how to bring a weapon onto school campus, or maybe Googling some sort of recent active shooter incident or mass casualty incident. So that's one of the safeguards is collaborating with the schools. We partner with several different social media platforms that we have working relationships with that all have their own threat assessment team, I would call a security team, that do monitor different posts and those things. And if there is something that does catch their attention, they will report it to either a local law enforcement agency, or there's several different federal or state agencies that they can also call and report it to, like, hey, we just got this tip, or we've seen this social media post. That agency will then look into it and then refer it over to whatever the appropriate law enforcement agency is. For us specifically in Stanislaus County, and speaking with Modesto, we do have what we call our threat assessment team. So we are lucky where we have a team of officers and detectives that are assigned to investigate these threats, not actively monitor social media, but we do investigate those threats as they come in. And we also have our criminal intelligence unit that does monitor social media, that gets notified whenever there's keywords that pop up, for example, gun, knife, bomb, those types of things. We do monitor those posts, and then our criminal intelligence unit will pass it on to the appropriate, detective, whoever might be investigating maybe that person, or just something like, hey, we just came across this and this is something that you need to know.
There's a lot of students who might not understand when they're gaming and in chat rooms, or just texting back and forth with friends using different chat platforms. Certain words can be identified, and then those can be risen to a level of PD or a school district in a very short period of time. And so I think we need to continue to educate students more and more on that, and then the possible consequences that also can come along with making that decision, whether they're in school accessing social media, or whether they are at home in the evening and gaming with their friends and then chatting something that where there's keywords that could be part of a threat.
So we know that there was, there were widespread threats, all up and down the state, actually nationwide, but specifically here in Stanislaus County. And we know that a number of arrests were made. So I'm assuming that, these students that were involved in the hoaxes were thinking, well, this is online, this is anonymous, there's no way that they're going to be able to trace it back to me, yet here we are. So can you talk a little bit about, and I understand if you can't disclose everything, but can you talk a little bit about your effectiveness actually of being able to identify those students that were directly involved?
Everything you do online is tracked. Nothing is not tracked anymore, from your social media platforms, from GPS to your phone, whatever it might be, everything is tracked. And with these in particular, there's different types of warrants that we can obtain based off of the social media. So we have emergency warrants that we can obtain. When we can show a specific threat to a school, then we can obtain an emergency warrant, and we can start gathering that, identifying information, whether that could be a screen name, it could be what device it came off of, what IP address it was using, anything like that. And then we can start working it back from there. And people might think, oh, well, I was on a free Wi-Fi at the library, or I was here, or I was there. Well, yeah, you might be, but it's still going to come back to a device. We're going to be able to run the numbers on that device, and we're going to be able to figure out who it is. So that's really the biggest thing, is everything you do is tracked. So you can think you're slick, and what we have seen is, I'm going to post on this account, but then I'm going to change the name, and they'll never know it was me. Those things. No, everything you do on there is tracked, and we're going to find out who you were.
Okay. And talk a little bit too about potential charges that, students may be facing, with involvement in something like this.
Yeah, so just on the criminal side, there's several different threats. You have threats towards a school or school official. You have making bomb threats, which is a different charge. You have what we call terrorist threats, which is threatening harm to somebody or a group of people. So just those right there are 3 very severe felony charges that a student could be looking at. And not just a student, but anybody who could be making these threats. With the school threat in general, if it's just a threat to the school, that's a lot easier of a charge that we can prove. Like, no, you made this threat just to the school or towards a school official. Now, for the other things, there's a little bit more investigative work that has to come into it, but those are felony charges that are going to stay on your record that you could look at, spending some time in juvenile hall or in a custody system on probation. And that can affect, just on the criminal side, could affect getting kicked out of school, could affect what school district you're able to go to, whatever that might be. And not to mention, restitution and having to pay and what your parents would have to go through. So there's a lot of things on the criminal side that we could charge that is going to have a long-term effect on a person.
Right. And Go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, no. So on the educational side of things, if you have a student who's made a threat, the consequences to that could certainly be suspension from school, but in a lot of cases could be expulsion, recommendation at that point due to the level of danger it poses. And in some cases, you see the hoaxes lead to a full response, like a lockdown of a school, et cetera. The amount of disruption that causes is immense. And also the trauma that's involved with staff and students when they have to go through, let's say, a hard lockdown situation of a longer duration, or they're afraid that, there might be an active threat on my campus and I'm locked down in my classroom. So you're talking about very serious impact. And as school districts, we look at it as suspension, a threat where we're able to confirm who the student is. You're most likely looking at an expulsion type scenario. Another thing students need to understand is that even if you're forwarding a threat, the impact of the initial threat might not be felt yet because it's existing on social media. But once a student takes that and forwards it on or puts a school name on it or specific information, they're taking that action to then really have the impact of that threat felt by everybody around them, even though they didn't create the initial one. And so this is some of what we're continuing to learn as we're living in the social media world that we are in today.
How can parents effectively monitor and talk with their kids about social media, about how it can be extremely problematic, as we're talking about today, but what do you see as kind of parent responsibility on their end? And I'm just going to open that up to both of you.
As a parent, right, really the responsibility begins at home. Speaking to your kids about social media, about the consequences, that your actions do have consequences, and you might think it's just a joke. You might think that, oh, I didn't mean anything by it. Well, there are consequences, criminally and just educationally, these consequences. And it's not just going to affect you, it's going to affect your siblings that are here in the school district or that may attend the same school. It's going to affect your parents. And so it really does start at home with the monitoring of social media, the monitoring of the phones. We live in an age of you have information at your fingertips. Really, it's the parents have to educate their kids, but then we have to take it a step further and, going through schools and law enforcement and really just taking that educational side and being on the same page, which I think is the biggest thing that's come out of these last few weeks, is we have a partnership between the school districts and local law enforcement, and it really showed that great relationship that we have where, yeah, you're hearing it from law enforcement, and law enforcement has always been, oh, you're exaggerating or they're going to be the bad guys. Well, now the education side is saying, no, you're going to be held accountable. And from our standpoint, that I think has been one of the best things that has come up out of this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really well said. And I think that as parents, we have to say anything that you put on social media, anything that you put through that phone or put on your laptop, absolutely can be seen. Don't put anything in there that you wouldn't, say out loud to your parents or to your teacher, because really the walls between what happens on social media and all those platforms and then the law enforcement in school, they're continuing to blend, especially when you have dangers like threats coming up on social media. Obviously, we can't stand by in either of our roles and say, well, okay, hey, this is just social media and the use of cell phones in the world we live in today. That kind of mindset is obviously not our approach and can't be. So we need to be proactive, both from the home front, PD and school districts, to say, we need to limit social media use as much as possible. I'd recommend limiting it at home, educating on the dangers of making threats, making racial slurs, anything like that, when you are at home. And then at school, absolutely minimum amount of use of cell phone, use of social media, focus on your academics.
Right. So, that's a whole different podcast, but one that we're likely going to do here in the not so distant future. But I concur with everything that you guys said and just want parents to be really thoughtful about. And I know that, look, all of your kids are going to say, but everybody else has it. Everybody else has a smartphone. That's not necessarily true, but it is in a lot of cases. And I think you can probably find a small group of parents that say like, hey, like we all agree, we're going to do this, and then we're going to hold the line, and then hopefully, that can grow.
I absolutely agree with that. And yeah, the way I think about it is, living in the real world versus the virtual world. Yeah. And our kids are spending too much time living in a virtual world and not interacting with each other in healthy ways and getting exercise and building those interpersonal skills that they're going to need in life, no matter how much our world is, driven by technology and the things that are going to come in the future.
Our kids learn from us. And so if they see us on our phone, whether it's connected via email at work, but to take that a step further, the kids are learning like, hey, if mom and dad are going out and, they're going for a run or they're going for a walk, and they see it's okay to put the phone down. I know in my house, much like you, I wasn't always the popular dad. But one of my roles was, hey, at the dinner table, there's no cell phones. We're not playing. I don't care if you're sitting there by yourself. We're not doing that at the dinner table. It's just what we don't do. So, and just establishing those boundaries, and then really explaining, like you said, I really like what you said about the reality in the virtual world. You might say something in a virtual world. Well, you're going to have real consequences that you're going to have to face, and as parents, just explaining that to the kids.
Right. So, just kind of final question. Throwing it out there, like, what do you think are some of the lessons learned from this, latest episode? And what would you do, or what will you be doing differently as these things come up in the future?
So for us, some of our lessons learned were the partnerships that we had in place already that we've spent time developing over the last several years, especially post-pandemic. That's one of the biggest lessons learned. Moving forward, there are some things that we do want to tweak as far as collaborating with all of the school districts and not just the high schools, because we are starting to see it at a younger and younger age, whether that be junior highs or elementary school even, and really getting our presence back into the schools, whether that be through various programs or outreach or what it might be, and just teaching kids, like we've been talking about, like there are consequences and this is what you could have to face. But then in addition to crafting those messages, partnering and at our level, we have found that we do a really good job of partnering together, but that doesn't always funnel down to the teachers or the officers, as we call it, the doers, the ones that are doing it day in and day out, and really letting them know, like, it's okay to take this and to ask more questions and to really get into what's going on. And because we've seen cases where it's not always a threat, it could be a cry for help. And that's what we really want to distinguish. And we won't be able to if we don't have those partnerships in place. So that's really what we're looking at moving forward from here.
Echo all of that. I know in my role, I work very closely with parents on a very regular basis. Their number one goal is the safety of their children. And I think that we can just get together with parents and talk about where we are with this issue and do some education, get their input, and then just kind of all work collaboratively on this issue together. It's doesn't look like it's something that any of us think is going away anytime soon. So we need to take it on proactively and work on the issue together.
Yeah. I know that districts really want to do a better job of communicating in real time with one another, even if there are districts that aren't being affected. The spillover, as we talked about before, parents will still have a lot of questions, and you will still need to communicate out to your parents and families, even if your district isn't necessarily being directly affected by this. How do we network, and then how do we effectively communicate out across the county that things are happening in District A, B, and or C, and then just communicating that with all of our parents in the county if that looks like that's necessary in real time. So I think that coordinated messaging going out regardless of the status in your particular district is really important moving forward. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you both for being here and talking about this really important topic. And I think there's a lot of interest, and I think people need to understand that school districts and law enforcement are working together on this, and absolutely our priority is the safety of students here in Stanislaus County.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Yeah.